Most of the time, when history repeats itself, it's not good. Here's a story that weaves together some pretty sad current events: the passing of Jimmy Carter, the inauguration of Donald Trump, and the ongoing tragedy in Gaza. UNFTR. As President Jimmy Carter lies in state, another dark reminder of his presidency looms. Israel and Hamas appear set to finalize a ceasefire agreement, barring any 11th-hour demands from Netanyahu.
After more than a year of bloodshed, a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas appears close. Outgoing US President Joe Biden said an agreement was on the brink. The deal would see Israel remove its troops from the most populated parts of Gaza in return for the gradual release of Israeli hostages. A Palestinian official has told the BBC that the terms of the deal were being finalised, with negotiations continuing in Qatar, both sides working in the same building for the first time.
It's eerily reminiscent of the hostage situation in Iran that resolved at the end of Carter's term, which we learned in hindsight was partially, but not entirely, prolonged by the Reagan team through backchannel negotiations designed to make Carter look bad. It's now well documented that Reagan's people had access to the Iranians via Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, both of whom were accused of engaging in shadow diplomacy through the auspices of the Trilateral Commission. Reagan's people were just fine slowing the process down, and Ayatollah Khomeini had no issue making Jimmy Carter look feckless. Draft after draft of the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran had been changed to suit Khomeini's whim, and as usual, everything came down to money. See, part of the issue was that millions of Iranian dollars were being held in escrow in American banks. That's how David Rockefeller became intimately involved in the negotiations. By the way, this was the same David Rockefeller that pressured the Carter administration to harbor the Shah of Iran when he was sick, and that was one of the reasons that the American embassy in Tehran was overthrown. So, the same person who helped contribute to the overthrow of the embassy by pressuring the administration to harbor the Shah was now protecting the interests of Chase Bank and prolonging the crisis on Carter's dime. Carter received word that the American hostages had been released as he sat on the stage watching his successor being sworn in. Instead of acting petulant or defiant, he asked Reagan for a small favor: to borrow the airplane one more time so he could greet the hostages upon their return. The man hadn't slept in days because he was so busy negotiating. And when he arrived, he did indeed greet each and every one of them by name. Joe Biden will receive no such grace from Donald Trump, and nor should he. According to DropSite's Jeremy Scahill, who has been as well sourced on the Palestinian end of the negotiations as anyone else, negotiators, quote, remain cautiously optimistic a deal will be signed, though they point to previous rounds of ceasefire negotiations that saw Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insert new demands in the 11th hour, effectively sabotaging the agreements, end quote. That Biden allowed this to continue beyond the initial wave of shelling is unconscionable. That they stood by while South Africa, in a matter of months, laid out a convincing genocide case against Israel is sickening. That they allowed Netanyahu to continue the campaign, all the while knowing that he was extending the war for political and personal self-preservation without even the slightest pushback is outrageous. Even more embarrassing, the incoming administration hasn't simply been negotiating from the sidelines. According to Hertz, Israel's paper of record, Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, has played a direct role in the negotiations. Again, these people aren't even in office yet. If in fact the remaining Israeli hostages are released, and there is some semblance of a deal made, it will merely demonstrate that Biden had the power and authority all along to make this happen. The path to earning the nickname Genocide Joe will be complete. Don't expect any deal to last, by the way. As soon as the news cycle blows over, Israel will resume hostilities in Gaza and press forward with its plans to annex northern parts at a minimum and increase their settlements in the West Bank. How do I know this? Again, just history repeating itself. When Jimmy Carter negotiated the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, the plight of the Palestinian people, and more specifically territorial boundaries and settlements, were considered in the negotiations. In the end, the accords were probably more notable for what was excluded. While there was language regarding the rights of Palestinians, it was couched in nebulous terms and relied on Knesset approval, continuing dialogue at the United Nations, and a prominent role for Jordan. But Jordan was excluded from the talks altogether and therefore had no interest in complying with loose agreements and side letters negotiated without its involvement. And this specific piece was negotiated in side letters, and that's a critical piece of information. There was also no specific path forward to resettle Palestinian refugees who were spread throughout Jordan, Syria, and other neighboring countries. The biggest omission, which would be a source of contention ever since the Accords, was the fate of Israeli settlements in the West Bank specifically. See, each side left with a different impression of the negotiations and the meaning behind those side letters. So almost immediately, the side letters were completely ignored. Within days of his return to Israel, Prime Minister Menachem Begin announced the construction of new settlements, and over the next few years, the Jewish population in the West Bank went from 5,000 to 24,000. So, if history is our guide, any negotiations to halt expansion into Palestinian territory won't be worth the paper it's printed upon. The only thing that will prevent Israel from completing the sweep of Gaza in the coming months, perhaps years, is the reality that there's nowhere for Gazans to go. Egypt remains on the brink of economic disaster. Jordan and Lebanon have assimilated as many families as possible given their respective infrastructures. Syria will be in utter turmoil for years, if not decades. The immediate migratory path of land-adjacent territories that are predominantly Sunni are essentially closed off. The idea of displacing nearly 2 million people by land migration is absurd enough. Contemplating a future where Palestinians are somehow moved en masse to settle territories outside of the immediate surroundings is science fiction. The answer, of course, is a return to the 68 borders in compliance with UN resolutions, but this too is a work of fiction, as Israel and its Western sponsors will never allow this or anything remotely close to it to happen, all of which makes this outcome even more tragic and despicable. Trump will take credit for the remaining hostages coming home to Israel and claim victory as the grand diplomat for the ages. Conditions will continue to worsen for Gazans, and the Western media will go silent, considering the chapter closed, because it's just easier to look away. This is why we study history, this is why we have to learn from it, and this is why we have to keep talking about this situation. Hey folks, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And remember, we produce a free weekly newsletter that drops every Saturday and covers major news articles from progressive outlets during the week. There's a progressive spotlight on somebody doing really good things in the world, an economic chart, and a whole bunch of other information that I know you will love. So go to unftr.com and sign up for our newsletter today.